Next to it, Beech Cottage, built by Mr. George Parr in about 1839 as a residence for his sisters, Sarah, Catherine and Mary Parr, who lived in it for many years, and all of whom died there, the last in 1879. It then became the property of Mrs. Henry Smith of Cropwell Grove. It was the home of the village schoolmaster, Mr. Barlow, when he took office in 1911, after Mr. Saxton. He had a little gate made in the fence between his house and the school, so that he could make straight for the school from his garden. The gate is still there. By reputation, Mr. Saxton could be very fierce, and children were watched even out of school hours for any misdemeanour, and would be called to account the next time they were at school.
The school, following the departure of Mr. Saxton, was under the rule of Mr. Barlow until 1937. His wife assisted him as deputy, and during the Great War, when Mr. Barlow joined the army, she became temporary headmistress.
At the back of the school, on what is now the play area, were the school allotments. The boys were allocated plots and used them for practical lessons in vegetable growing under the eye of Mr. Barlow. In the picture, taken in 1913, the boy in the foreground is Dennis Barrett, who is now aged 95.
For all its newness, the school had its drawbacks. The heating system was very crude, a stove in the corner of each room, resulting in extreme cold in areas away from the heat. A system of water heating was installed in 1930, but in winter this was prone to freeze and caused the closure of the school until it was repaired. When Mr. Barlow left in mid-1937, his place was taken by a woman, Miss Beatrice Cuthbert. This did not please the village folk, but Miss Cuthbert was enthusiastic, tireless and dedicated, and the villagers grew to admire her. After the war, the dividing railings in the playground were removed. The pan lavatories were replaced by water lavatories, and from then on, the lavatories froze each winter and the pipes often burst. On March 11, 1955, the headmistress recorded that except for 1 week at the beginning of February, this was the first day that lavatories had been functioning properly since Christmas due to frost. Since many were from Cropwell Bishop, inevitably the required new school was built there, and Cropwell Butler School closed in 1968. The village hall took shape in 1969 when a meeting of villagers decided to purchase the old school as an alternative to the existing hall which stood on the green in front of the school. The old hall, erected in 1939, was made of wood and had been built with money raised by whist drives, dances and other events in the late 30s. The old hall was well loved by many. It was a major undertaking to raise the money to buy and refit the school. The stage extension was added to the existing hall, and later the dressing room was built, and only 10 years ago the lavatory block was added at a cost of over £25,000. North of the village hall, the L-shaped property now called Stoneleigh was in the early part of the century a coal business belonging to the Revells. The Revells were also carriers at the end of the 19th century, operating a service to Newark on Wednesdays and to Nottingham on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Later, the Allbones lived there. The rear part of the L was the stables.
Butler coal merchants. I remember at least 3, including my dad. He did a bit to ache the farm out because it was hard work in those days, but the Revells, next door to the village school, which is now the village hall, they did quite a lot with the horse and dray, and used to fetch the coal from Radcliffe Station, and I think they delivered in Radcliffe as well as round the Cropwells, both Cropwell Butler and Cropwell Bishop, and to the school and sometimes to the church. And
Inglenook Cottage has a long history. It seems to have started as 2 cottages, and in old pictures of it there are 2 doors and a pump just outside the porch. Mrs. Shipside held sway as sub-postmistress for 15 years in this house.
Lewis's stackyard was opposite Inglenook. This is remembered as a cluster of farm buildings and a disused area of land now occupied by Barnfield, Norwood and Redlands, on which, when he started his bus service, Jack Lewis used to keep his bus. During the 30s, the then landlord of the Plough, Mr. Smith, opened a short-lived fish and chip shop on the open ground in Lewis's stackyard.
Old Lewis was the carrier before the advent of buses, and before him Michael Thirlby and Robert Revel were carriers. Unless you were rich, the only other forms of transport were bicycles or walking. Later this century, Mrs. Forth of the Court bought Lewis's land, and Mr. Lewis moved to the old post office on the Green, where Granny Lewis ran a shop. Again, on the opposite side, we pass the May Tree, built in the former garden of Inglenook, and come to the barn conversions. Until recently, this was a builder's yard, and before that belonged to Hubbard's farm, based on the farmhouse which is now called the Firs, standing behind the poplars. This farm was, in this century, run by a Mr. Clark, who was also a butcher, and from whom you could buy meat by calling at the barn and ringing a bell.
The Poplars is probably the oldest building in the village, having been built as a farmhouse in about 1760, the front wing added in about 1780. Here lived two old ladies, Miss James and Miss Bird, later followed by George Hawthorne, who took the house in 1938.
Beyond the Poplars, the little bungalow Rosebank replaced a cottage in which lived Miss Carver, who sold sweets and other bits and pieces in her front room. Many ladies seem to supplement their incomes in this way. The Franktons of Tythby Road, Mrs. Beat, Granny Lewis and others, in addition to which, certainly in the last century, most wives and daughters of agricultural labourers worked at home on unfinished lace, separating the breadths of machine-made lace and scalloping the edges. The lace was brought out from Nottingham by the carrier.
In this century, many girls went into domestic service.
There was nothing but agriculture, and boys went on the land and girls went into service at the Grove. Wages were 16 shillings a week for men, 3 shillings and sixpence for boys, and £4 a year for girls for the first year. I had 1.5 miles to walk to work and had to be ready by 6 a.m. When I was old enough, I was hired out for £7 and a year on Harry Smith's farm and lived in. Summertime, we worked from light until dusk. And I ploughed with a pair of horses when I was 10 and swung a scythe with the best of them at 16. I knew at Mayfair, in what they called the hiring statutes, I used to stand on the town hall steps and have my arms and legs pinched by the farmers to see if I was strong. My first year I got 7 gold sovereigns and my keep for a whole year.
Franklin's Nook, so named after the field behind it, was 3 cottages occupied by well-known families in the village, the Battys, the Widowsons and the Branstons who owned them. Next we see Mahon, a splendid house built in 1855 by Henry Smith for his mother and sister and then called the Cottage. His sister remained there until 1864. In the 20s and 30s of this century, Mahon was occupied by Mr. W.P. Green, known to most as Pudding or Pud Green.
Outside Mahon, in the wall around the roadside, are 2 massive pillars of stone which clearly mark the site of gates. These were the gates to the yard, behind which Henry Smith had workshops for a blacksmith, saddler, carpenters and butchers for his estate. Many of the so-called Henry Smith gates were made here, similar to the gate at Franklin's Nook and those on the Green. The saddlery was the building still seen along the roadside, and beyond this 2 hinges can be seen protruding from the brick wall. Standing back from the wall, you can see that there is clearly another walled-up entrance, this time to the village pound, which was built in 1836. Stray animals would be driven to the pound to await collection by the owners, from whom the parish could exact a fine. Sometimes malevolent villagers would collect animals for the purpose of claiming the reward for returning them to the pound.
Passing the Victorian letterbox, and didn't they have small envelopes in those days, we are skirting the orchard of Mahon, now replaced by a house which was built only recently by the last of the Smith family to reside here, Mr. Butler Smith. Now we are facing the site of the last smithy in the village, now called the Old Forge. This closed in 1985, ending a family tradition of 3 generations that began in 1891, although the smithy itself dates from many years before this. It stood facing a pond, and across the road on what is now called the village green stood a cluster of mud cottages built on the so-called wastes for the poor of the parish. A dyke, called the Usher Dyke, ran across the end of the village and was bridged by planks to give access to the cottages. After the Enclosures Act took effect, these cottages provided rent-free accommodation until 1843.
In 1851, this land and the other wastes, houses and manorial rights was sold to Henry Smith, who in due course improved some but pulled down most of the cottages, including those on the green, enclosing this and the pond with stone or brick walls. The green now became gardens, that is allotments, which into this century were worked by villagers. The allotments were known as the cabbage patch or hill gas, or even simply the gas, and comprised of a substantial mound of earth so that allotments sloped towards the walls. A well was sunk to replace the pond and a pump and horse trough installed. The pump and the wall were provided by Henry Smith in 1869.
In 1960, the parish, helped by contributions from residents, bought the cabbage patch and levelled it and made it into a village garden. Before the war, much ill feeling was aroused when Cuthbert Smith, from whom the land was purchased, claimed the coping and top course of stone blocks from the wall, taking them to his house Greenways to build a rockery. This has resulted in the rather unsatisfactory cement capping with which the wall is now finished.
They took them all away.
Cuthbert Smith
Cuthbert
collected
Smith took them all away.
the stones.
Yeah.
He took the
I think-
capping
And
and
one
the
layer
top
of
layer of
stones.
stone.